Greetings, listeners. So, this will be the first in a series of shorter videos, and each will cover a chapter of my latest book project, which covers the period 1914 to 1945. I call this period the Third Supercycle because it's the third episode of hegemonic contestation in the world system where a previous hegemony or hegemon fades away, and then there's a big fight, usually military, but also economic, political, and cultural competition over new hegemon or hegemons. This happened 3 times in our history as a species since 1492. So the very first was the 30 Years' War, and the second supercycle, was the 1775 to 1815. This is the period of the Atlantic revolutions and uprisings and of the Napoleonic Wars. And then the third is 1914-1945, where the American Empire replaces the British Empire as the single most powerful polity of the world system and sets the rules until really between 1945 and 2008. So this text is specifically covering the period of 1914-1945, and what it's doing, which is new, is telling a transnational version of this history. We have excellent histories of individual national empires and polities during this period, but we do not yet have our transnational histories. They're beginning to be written. They're great historians. Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands is a wonderful example of a transnational history done right, but we're just beginning to develop the tools to do this properly. So hopefully in the future this will open a conversation and open a dialogue between different members, different historians, but also people who are interested in history and their nook of history, and they begin to understand the connections and think through. Because all history is becoming comparative, just as all literature has become comparative, all media has become comparative, all politics is becoming comparative. We're becoming a united planet of 8 billion people. We have to know each other's histories to get anywhere as a species. So that's the bird's eye view of the text. So specifically, chapter 1 sets out the opening act of the Third Supercycle, and that's the outbreak of World War I. The one writer that I rely heavily on for the explanation as to why 1914 happens is Paul W. Schroeder, great historian, taught for years at the University of Illinois, and he had one of the best explanations for the specific outbreak of war. And he referred to it not as the outbreak of war. He said we shouldn't think of it as the outbreak of war. We should think of it as the end of a long peace. In other words, 1914 is the moment that a previous social order begins to implode. And that social order was that of the British Empire, which was the reigning hegemon of the 19th century. So really between 1815 to 1914, Britain has the most powerful economy, biggest military, controls the world's oceans, and it sets the rules for the world system. And what happens is that breaks down. And the reason is simply that during the 19th century, other empires arise, industrialization starts to happen, and other polities show up and they start to challenge Britain's position. The famous example, of course, is the United States, a very small economy in 1783 when it gets its independence. But by 1913, the United States is generating, we think, about 22% of the world economy. And at that time, the British Empire was generating only 20% of the world economy. So the United States was actually producing more, at a larger output. So Britain is no longer able to simply run the world economy the way it used to. It used to be the largest, not anymore. Now there are other players, and so there's a difficult adjustment process that begins to happen. Now, the other side of 1914, which is very important to stress, and this is something that's very difficult for us to imagine here in the early 21st century, and that is how different human society was back in 1914. And the biggest single difference is that the world was run by colonial empires. It simply was. Back in 1910, before the fall of the Qing dynasty, 90% of all human beings on the planet were members of 14 world empires. So literally 9 out of 10 people, and an equivalent share of the world economy was controlled by just 14 polities. It's a degree of political centralization which has never happened before in human history and will never happen again because we'll be living in much more democratic polities. Just 14, and those 14 couldn't agree on things, and thus the explosion of the early 20th century. So the outbreak of war as the end of a long peace. And I've mentioned the U.S. empire, and there were others, of course. Germany had built a huge empire. The Roman Empire had expanded. The Japanese Empire. There was the Italian Empire, and on and on and on. But why did the war break out the way it did specifically? Well, one of the reasons, there are a bunch of reasons, but one of the most important reasons is that when the British couldn't run the world system just on the basis of just sheer might or sheer economic weight, they used a raft of coping strategies in the latter half of the 19th century. And one of those coping strategies was the transformation of the geopolitical world system into something like a casino. Now, if this sounds familiar, it's that we have lived through something similar, and that is the United States, in the second half of its hegemony, created a neoliberal world order, and it transferred huge parts of the world economy into a casino run by Wall Street. Well, the British Empire sort of did the same thing in the late 19th century. They didn't call it a casino, but it was a casino. And the problem with this is that the empires were staking bets in this casino that they couldn't cover. In fact, 5 of the most important players of the world system in 1914 were 5 semi-peripheral empires, and these had all grown mighty and powerful, and they wanted a piece of the action, and so they gambled and gambled, and the nature of their gambles eventually led to war. These 5 semi-peripheral empires, the Austrian Empire, the German Empire, the Roman Empire, the Italian Empire, and the Japanese Empire, all launched sort of colonial adventurisms aimed at solving their domestic problems by basically attacking other polities and acquiring and annexing, engaging in colonialism and settler colonial violence of various kinds. Now, there's a wide range of these, and I go into greater detail as to each of these empires and how they react to each other and what their strategies are. But notice from the very first, there's something interesting about those 5. They're not united in any way. In fact, they're going to go to war with each other in World War I. So the Romanov and Italian empires and Japanese empires, they join the Entente, whereas the Austrian and German empires are the core of the Central Powers. Okay, so they don't have a common scheme amongst each other. They're all competing against each other. Okay, by contrast, the wealthy and oldest of the empires, the Belgian, British, French, and U.S. empires, are much better at cooperating. And this will be a crucial leitmotif of my text, and that is that the nature of their colonialism is very different from that of the semi-peripheral empires. The core empires, again, Belgium, Britain, France, United States, and the Netherlands, only 4 would join World War I, all 5 would participate in World War II. Because they already have empires and they're going through industrialization, they would pursue a strategy of neo-colonial expansionism, which is basically betting on the house. So you're not doing anything risky, you're not just trying to grab terrain, you're doing things that will get you a return. So you don't want risk. So they do low-cost, low-risk things, and they're much better at cooperating because they understand the limits of force. The semi-peripheral empires that I mentioned don't have that. They don't have big empires. They want empires, and so they use force to get them. And that's the root cause of a lot of the violence. So what basically happens in 1914 is you have an international casino, and the semi-peripheries all place their bets. And then they can't cover their bets. And that's the catastrophe that ensues. Whereas the core polities, Britain, France, the United States, they have the money to cover their bets. And so they're okay, but it's the semi-periphery that gets into trouble. Okay. The next part of the chapter, I focus on 4 myths about World War I, and this is sort of a little prelude because the chapter 2 actually covers the actual fighting of World War I, the specific campaigns, the military strategies, the economic strategies, and the mobilizations that take place, as well as some of the consequences. The 4 myths, the very first and most obvious myth, this is something that you hear a lot in mass media, is the notion that Germany could have somehow have won the war if it had followed something called the Schlieffen Plan. And the gist of it is to put all of your army on the Western Front and attack France first, defeat them, and then deal with the Romanov Empire on the eastern flank. The problem is that historians have looked through the archives, and which are extensive and copious, and have concluded that there's no such thing as the Schlieffen Plan. Germany in 1914 was a dynastic monarchy ruled by the Hohenzollern family, and the military planning back then was very, very haphazard and very limited by modern standards. So these were not industrial armies that used machines and fuel and mechanized forces. All that would come later. These were conscript armies that served an emperor, and their planning was very simple. It was, get a certain number of soldiers to the station at a certain time, give them all rifles, defeat the enemy. So Schlieffen did work on a bunch of plans, but they were all contingent. They were just tactical maps, basically. They were general guidelines of the battle. And the notion that there was some way to win the war early, there is no real evidence for that. And the reason that no one could win the war early on is that the nature of warfare had changed. It had become industrial warfare. Artillery, automatic rifles, the very first ones of them, and most of all machine guns, led the soldiers to create trenches, and you just had trench war. So this industrialization of warfare, which had happened at the very end of the American Civil War, but there weren't machine guns in that way. There were small numbers of the equivalent of machine guns, Gatling guns, but they're only in fixed positions and they're very heavy. So nothing like the mobile machine gun that just could literally sweep through a field and harm large numbers of soldiers and just make offensive operations a complete nightmare. So no army in 1914 could have defeated any of the other armies. It was going to be a battle of attrition from the very beginning. Second myth about World War I, and this is more obvious, actually an interesting myth, and the myth is that most of the fighting took place on the Western Front. In other words, between the French and German forces, and British, French, American, and German forces. Actually, the largest number of soldiers and the greatest loss of civilian life occurs on the Eastern Front, between the Romanov Empire and the Austrian and German forces. And briefly, the Romania also participated in the war briefly. It was defeated in the midst of the war, but those three empires were the largest. So both fronts were important, and in fact this myth about the importance, both were important to the war. There's a subvariant of this, which is the third myth, and that's the notion that World War I was a European civil war. And that is equally untrue. No, that's not true. World War I was a true world conflict. It affected all polities. Roughly 60% of the planet, in terms of polities, would participate by the end. It involved all of Europe. It involved most of Africa. It involved huge swathes of Asia. And there was fighting in every continent, and there was also fighting in the world's oceans. It was also about maritime power, and it was also about the colonies that Germany had in Africa and elsewhere, which were taken over by the Entente fairly quickly. So this was a true world conflict, and the stakes were planetary. The stakes were, who's going to run the world system? Was it going to continue to be the British, even though they couldn't really do it anymore and didn't have the muscle, or was some other power going to do it? The answer historically was, of course, the Americans were going to run things after 1945 and would run things until 2008. But no one knew this back then, so everyone was trying to get that edge. The fourth and final myth is actually the subject of my next video and the next chapter, chapter 2, and that's the notion that the Central Powers had a chance, a small but immeasurable chance of winning the war. And this is simply not the case. They could not have won the war for the simple reason that this was an industrial conflict using most of the resources and empires, involving most of the empires of the planet and most of the resources of the major empires, and therefore materiel was the most important factor. And not just materiel, but how logistics worked, how organization worked, how industrial productivity operated. And in all those categories, the Entente had decisive advantages at the Central Powers because they were semi-peripheries and had less developed economies, less industry, fewer factories, smaller populations. There's no way they could overcome the Entente advantage, ever. This is true in the naval war, this is true on land. It just took longer on land because there was an attrition principle. And it also took a long time for the Entente to come up with the tactics that won the war. And the tactics that would win would be accelerated attrition. So the invention of sort of a limited version of mobile warfare involving the use of tanks and artillery and aircraft for spotting purposes and reconnaissance, and also better logistics using trucks for logistics, and basically the initial mechanization and automobilization of warfare. That all happens in 1917, 1918. So, but that's a subject for the next video, which will cover chapter 2. So I'll stop here and continue there.